In the golden age of American industry, one company built the engines that won wars, powered cities, and kept a nation moving. But behind the roar of diesel and the shine of chrome was a story far darker, a tale of greed, betrayal, and mechanical obsession that would ultimately destroy its own creator. This isn't just about machines, it's about the people who built them, broke them, and buried them. From the battlefields of World War II to the boardrooms of corporate America, this is the rise and fall of Detroit Diesel, the company that once defined American power and the scandalous empire that tore it apart. Born in the fires of war. It's 1940, Europe is burning, and across the Atlantic, Detroit is roaring. Factories that once built cars are now being gutted, retooled, and repurposed into weapons of war. The American automobile industry, the pride of capitalist peace, is about to become the beating heart of the Allied war machine. At the center of it all stood General Motors, the biggest, richest, most powerful industrial empire on Earth. But beneath that mountain of chrome and profit, something darker was brewing. A quiet race to build a new kind of heart for the machines of war. Not gasoline, not steam, but diesel. A fuel that burned slower, hit harder, and could keep tanks crawling and ships moving long after the gas engines sputtered out. The idea wasn't new. Rudolf Diesel had invented his engine back in the 1890s, before mysteriously disappearing overboard on a ship to England in 1913. The official story said suicide. The unofficial one said oil cartel assassination. Either way, his invention had become too powerful to ignore. By the time World War II loomed, diesel engines powered everything that mattered: submarines, destroyers, and locomotives, and the United States was embarrassingly behind. GM's own divisions, Buick, Cadillac, Chevrolet, were built on gasoline. They knew luxury, not longevity. Efficiency wasn't sexy, but when war contracts started flying, efficiency suddenly meant victory. That's where Detroit Diesel was born. In 1938, GM quietly established a new division dedicated solely to building compact, high-speed diesel engines. Engines light enough for trucks and tanks, but tough enough for the battlefield. By 1940, those early two-stroke diesels, crude, loud, and vicious, were churning out of the Detroit diesel plant like mechanical demons. Soldiers would later nickname them "screamin' jimmies" for their shrieking, high-pitched roar that could wake the dead. And yet, that awful sound meant life. It meant power. It meant another convoy of supply trucks clawing its way through mud and artillery fire in Europe. To the average GY, it was just another engine. But to GM's executives, it was the golden ticket. Each engine rolling off the line meant another federal contract, another mountain of money. Detroit Diesel became a factory of both survival and greed. The U.S. Army didn't care how loud they were or how toxic the fumes. They just wanted results, and GM delivered, stamping out engines faster than the government could count. But it wasn't all patriotic glory. Behind the victory posters and smiling factory workers were 12-hour shifts, molten metal burns, and the constant haze of diesel smoke that hung over Detroit like a fog of ambition. In the machine shops, the noise was apocalyptic. Drills screamed, hammers clanged, and foremen shouted until their voices gave out. The air reeked of hot oil and sweat. Men and women alike worked until their knuckles split, and their hair turned gray from exhaustion. And yet, nobody dared complain. Because in wartime Detroit, the factory floor wasn't just a workplace, it was a battlefield. And while the rest of America rationed rubber and sugar, Detroit Diesel couldn't build fast enough. By 1943, it was producing thousands of engines a month, the kind of industrial output that made generals weep with joy and competitors seethe with jealousy. Inside GM's own empire, rival divisions fumed. The automotive aristocrats at Cadillac and Oldsmobile looked down on the diesel division like a bastard child. Dirty, noisy, and beneath their polished standards. But that bastard was making money hand over fist, and money, in Detroit, was the only form of nobility that mattered. By the time the war ended in 1945, Detroit Diesel had gone from a tiny experiment to a mechanical juggernaut. Its engines powered tanks, ships, bulldozers, and even the lifeblood of the post-war reconstruction effort. America didn't just win the war, it industrialized victory. But in the shadows of that triumph was a question no one at GM dared to ask. What happens when the war ends and the world no longer needs so many engines of destruction? Detroit Diesel was about to find out, and when peacetime came, it wouldn't sound like silence. It would sound like the scream of a two-stroke engine echoing through a city that had forgotten how to rest. The screaming engines of hell. When the war ended, Detroit Diesel didn't slow down, it just changed uniforms. The same factories that once churned out engines for tanks and landing craft were now feeding a new kind of army. Truckers, builders, and businessmen chasing the American dream down a highway of smoke and steel. The world had been rebuilt by diesel power, and Detroit Diesel's two-stroke engines were its anthem. Loud, unrelenting, and unmistakable. They screamed, rattled, and shook like mechanical banshees clawing their way out of hell. To ordinary people, it was noise, but to the men who drove them, it was music. The Screamin' Jimmy, as it became known, wasn't just an engine, it was a personality. The 671, the 8V71, the 12V71, they all carried that same tortured soul. Each one could shake a parking lot, rattle a diner window, and make small children cry 3 streets away. They leaked oil, they smoked like chimneys, and they demanded to be treated like living, angry things. But God, they worked. Truckers loved them because they were indestructible. You could redline a Jimmy until the valves screamed for mercy, and it would still drag 40 tons of steel up a mountain pass. They were so overbuilt that some truckers joked you could shoot one, and it would keep running out of spite. That reputation made Detroit Diesel a legend. It also made it a monster. Because while America was falling in love with the sound of raw horsepower, engineers inside the company were losing their minds. The two-stroke diesel engine was a mechanical paradox, brilliant on paper, cursed in practice. It needed perfect timing, perfect lubrication, and perfect maintenance. But in the hands of real-world truckers, perfect wasn't an option. When it ran right, the engine was a symphony. When it didn't, it was chaos, blowing seals, spewing oil, and belching fire like a steel dragon with indigestion. Entire repair shops across the Midwest made their living off Detroit Diesel's temper tantrums, and yet the company didn't care. Every rebuild was still a sale. Every failure meant more parts, more service, more money. To the executives back in Detroit, the Screamin' Jimmy was the golden goose that never stopped honking. But not everyone shared their enthusiasm. As the engine spread into buses, fishing boats, and construction equipment, complaints began to pile up. Residents near shipping ports described the sound as a mechanical apocalypse. Factory workers started losing hearing before the age of 30. Mechanics called them widowmakers because of their unpredictable blowouts and the shrapnel that followed. There were even rumors, whispered among truckers, that GM knew the engines were dangerously unstable under certain conditions. Over-revving, overheating, oil starvation, the engineers knew all the weak spots, but fixing them would mean redesigning the heart of the engine itself, and that meant money. So they didn't. Instead, they doubled down. In the 1950s, Detroit Diesel unleashed a whole new line of engines that were even bigger, even louder, and even more temperamental. They became the backbone of America's freight system, powering everything from Greyhound buses to tugboats. The world ran on screaming metal, and Detroit was the high priest of the noise. By then, the name Detroit Diesel meant power, endurance, and defiance, the sound of industry refusing to die. But inside the company's own walls, the engineers were quietly terrified. The two-stroke engine design was reaching its limits. It was inefficient, loud, and dirty. Emission standards were tightening. Technology was changing. And yet GM kept milking the same aging design because it still made money. It was the classic Detroit story. Innovation replaced by inertia. What had started as a wartime miracle was turning into a mechanical addiction. And the addicts weren't the drivers. They were the men in suits. In bars along the highways, old truckers would raise a beer to the Screamin' Jimmy, half in reverence, half in relief that they'd survived it. They loved those engines, but they also feared them. The noise, the fumes, the danger. Because in truth, Detroit Diesel's engines didn't just power America's post-war boom, they haunted it. They were the soundtrack of a nation that refused to slow down, even as its machines began to scream for mercy. The corporate civil war inside GM. By the late 1950s, Detroit Diesel was a monster that General Motors couldn't control. Loud, profitable, and too powerful for its own good. The war had ended more than a decade ago, but inside GM's towering glass offices, a new battle had begun. Not against Ford or Chrysler or foreign imports. This one was personal. A civil war fought between the gasoline aristocrats and the diesel outcasts. GM had always seen itself as a cathedral of order. Every division had its pew. Chevrolet built for the masses, Cadillac for the rich, Buick for the respectable, and GMC for the working class. But Detroit Diesel, it didn't fit anywhere. It didn't build cars, it didn't sell style. It sold raw, mechanical rage. And to the corporate elite upstairs, that made it a nuisance. Yet the nuisance made money, a lot of it. Diesel engines powered everything from buses to bulldozers, and every one of those engines was a GM paycheck. But instead of celebrating that success, the company turned it into a turf war. Executives from the car division saw diesel as dirty work, something beneath their chrome-plated image. Engineers who worked on the two-strokes were treated like the black sheep of the family. Brilliant, but embarrassing to bring to dinner. And still, Detroit Diesel's numbers kept climbing. That infuriated the gasoline divisions. Cadillac engineers mocked Diesel's crude design. Chevrolet managers complained that diesel contracts got the best steel. The friction grew until it wasn't just rivalry, it was sabotage. Memos were lost. Budgets were redirected. Meetings were forgotten. Every department fought to protect its slice of the empire. The chaos spread like oil on concrete. GM's executives had grown drunk on their own bureaucracy, stacking committees on top of committees until no one could tell who was actually in charge. The men running Detroit Diesel were brilliant engineers, but they were trapped in a system that rewarded politics over progress. Every new idea had to crawl through a swamp of paperwork, egos, and hidden agendas. Meanwhile, the outside world was changing fast. The interstate highway system was exploding. Trucking was becoming the lifeblood of America's economy. And Detroit Diesel was sitting on the technology that could dominate it all. Compact, fuel-efficient engines that could last 1,000,000 miles. But GM, blinded by its obsession with the glamorous world of automobiles, didn't see a future in diesel. Cars were sexy, trucks were not. So they starved Detroit Diesel of funding. Instead of reinvesting profits into research and innovation, GM's board siphoned them off to keep Cadillac's tail fins shiny and Chevrolet's marketing flashy. The diesel engineers were left scraping for resources, cannibalizing old designs and running test engines on borrowed parts. It was corporate negligence disguised as strategy. By the early 1960s, frustration boiled over. Internal reports warned that Detroit Diesel was falling behind foreign competitors. Companies like Cummins and Mercedes-Benz were building quieter, more efficient diesels. But when engineers raised the alarm, they were ignored. GM's leadership believed its empire was untouchable. After all, they owned half the automotive world. What could possibly go wrong? Behind closed doors, though, the whispers had started. Some said the diesel division's profits were being deliberately understated to make it easier to shut down. Others claimed rival executives were manipulating data to kill new engine programs before they could threaten gasoline sales. Whether true or not, morale in the diesel plants collapsed. The people who had once built engines that powered tanks and saved nations were now treated like second-class citizens in their own company. The pride of wartime Detroit had become an internal embarrassment, a reminder of a dirtier, noisier, less glamorous time. Yet, even in its corner, Detroit Diesel refused to die quietly. Its engineers, underfunded and overworked, kept experimenting. They tinkered with turbochargers, fuel injectors, and lightweight blocks. Anything to squeeze more power out of the aging two-stroke design. They knew they were fighting a losing war, but they fought anyway. Because for the men and women inside those smoke-choked factories, Detroit Diesel wasn't just a division of GM. It was Detroit itself. Stubborn, loud, proud, and impossible to kill. And up in the marble offices, the executives didn't realize it yet, but their own civil war was tearing the company apart. The empire that had conquered the world with engines was now choking on its own fumes. The workers' revolt. By the mid-1960s, Detroit was drowning in its own success. The factories roared day and night, but the people running them were suffocating. What had started as the heartbeat of American industry was turning into a furnace, one that burned through men faster than it burned diesel. Inside the Detroit diesel plants, the air was thick with smoke, sweat, and resentment. 12-hour shifts, deafening machinery, and management that treated workers like disposable pistons. Injuries were so common that missing fingers became a badge of honor. Safety reports, ignored, complaints, lost in paperwork. The men who had built the engines that won a world war were now barely surviving their own company, and they were angry. The United Auto Workers Union, once GM's uneasy partner, started to smell blood. Rumors of walkouts spread through the plant floors like gasoline fumes. Workers wanted fair pay, safer conditions, and, most dangerously, respect. GM had grown fat on their labor, while executives in suits polished their Cadillacs with the profits. The message from management was clear: be grateful you have jobs. The message from the factory floor was clearer: try us. It started small: slowdowns, missed quotas, and a few accidental equipment malfunctions. But by 1968, Detroit Diesel was a powder keg. The war in Vietnam was raging. America was tearing itself apart, and the city of Detroit was already on fire, literally. When the Detroit riots exploded in the summer of '67, many of those who took to the streets by night were Detroit diesel workers by day. The rebellion wasn't just political, it was personal. Decades of exploitation, of being the dirty engine division no one wanted to talk about, had boiled over. And this time, they weren't going to be quiet. Union leaders marched into GM headquarters demanding reform. Management smiled, nodded, and stalled. Every meeting ended the same way, with empty promises and thicker smoke. It wasn't until a series of catastrophic strikes hit Detroit in the late '60s that GM finally realized what was happening. The workers weren't bluffing anymore. Entire assembly lines went silent. Trains sat idle. Engine shipments to the military were delayed for the first time since World War II. GM panicked. Their empire, the same one that had survived depression, war, and bureaucracy, was suddenly at the mercy of the men who actually turned the wrenches. In the press, executives called it labor instability. On the ground, it was war. Workers flooded the streets with picket signs and chants that echoed through the industrial valley. Scabs were threatened, police were called, and some nights ended with broken windows and bloodied noses. Detroit Diesel had become a microcosm of America itself. The powerful versus the powerless, the polished versus the filthy, the boardroom versus the boiler room. But here's the twist. For a brief, shining moment, the workers won. By 1970, after months of strikes and negotiations, the UAW forced GM to agree to one of the most generous labor contracts in American history. Higher wages, better safety standards, and benefits that finally gave the men who built the engines a piece of the empire they powered. It should have been a victory. But like everything in Detroit, it came with a curse. The New Deal made the plants more expensive to run. Profit margins shrank. The corporate elite upstairs, furious at being humiliated by their own workers, began plotting revenge. Instead of investing in innovation, GM's leadership doubled down on penny pinching and corporate sabotage. If they couldn't control the unions, they'd starve them. Budgets were slashed, new projects delayed, and entire departments quietly outsourced. The very people who had fought for their dignity were now accused of killing productivity. It was poetic and tragic. The revolt had given the workers a voice, but GM was about to make sure they'd never use it again. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was changing. Japanese manufacturers like Toyota and Isuzu were learning how to build diesel engines faster, cheaper, and cleaner. GM didn't care, or maybe it just didn't understand. The corporate infighting had blinded them to the global threat that was already on their doorstep. Detroit Diesel had survived wars, greed, and betrayal, but now it was being quietly strangled, not by outsiders but by its own creators. The revolt ended. The chants faded. The workers went back to their machines. But something had changed in Detroit forever. The city that once built America's dreams was now building its own tomb. The diesel deception of the 1980s. By the 1980s, Detroit Diesel had survived everything. War, riots, and corporate betrayal, but it couldn't survive General Motors' genius idea to fix a dying market with a lie. See, the world was changing. Gas prices were exploding after the oil crisis of the 70s, and Americans were suddenly pretending to care about fuel economy. Drivers who once bragged about cubic inches and horsepower were now counting miles per gallon. GM panicked. They'd built their empire on gas-guzzling beasts, and now those beasts were being hunted by Japanese imports. So, the executives came up with a brilliant plan: make Americans love diesel cars. There was only one problem. Detroit Diesel built great diesel trucks, not great diesel cars. And instead of actually engineering something new, GM decided to slap diesel technology onto their existing gasoline engines. They took a 350 cubic inch gas block, modified it just enough to call it a diesel, and threw it into Oldsmobiles, Buicks, and Cadillacs. On paper, it was revolutionary. In reality, it was a ticking, oil-soaked time bomb. These engines barely worked. They leaked fuel, blew head gaskets, and stalled without warning. Mechanics called them suicide motors. Customers called them worse. And every time one of those engines exploded on the highway, it wasn't Oldsmobile or Buick that took the blame. It was diesel. GM's marketing department spun it as the future of American efficiency. In truth, it was the beginning of the end. Detroit Diesel's name was dragged through the mud by association. People didn't know the difference between GM's fake car diesels and Detroit Diesel's heavy-duty engines, and GM never bothered to explain. To the public, diesel now meant smoky, unreliable junk. Inside GM, panic turned into paranoia. Lawsuits flooded in, dealerships were furious, and the press roasted the company alive. Consumer Reports called the engines catastrophic failures. But rather than admit fault, GM doubled down. They blamed mechanics, blamed the oil companies, blamed bad driving habits. Anything but themselves. The scandal spread fast. By 1982, the words GM and diesel were synonymous with lemon. Truck drivers stopped bragging about their screamin' jimmies. Fleet buyers canceled contracts. Even military orders slowed. The brand that had powered America's victory in World War II was now the punchline of late-night talk shows. And here's the sick irony. Detroit Diesel hadn't even built those cursed car engines. But GM, in its infinite arrogance, let the diesel division take the hit anyway. The company had effectively sabotaged its own legend. Inside Detroit Diesel's offices, engineers were furious. They'd spent decades perfecting real diesel technology, tough, efficient, battle-tested machines. And now the word diesel was radioactive. Their reputation was burned at the stake by corporate greed. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was moving on. European automakers like Mercedes-Benz and Volkswagen were producing small, reliable diesel cars that actually worked. Japan was mastering fuel injection. And GM? They were busy writing press releases about temporary setbacks. It wasn't just bad engineering, it was corporate malpractice. The 1980s should have been Detroit Diesel's rebirth. Global trade was booming, shipping was expanding, and demand for heavy engines was higher than ever. But GM's top brass refused to let Detroit Diesel operate independently. Every budget, every contract, every innovation had to crawl through the same red tape that had strangled them for decades. By 1985, the damage was irreversible. Sales plummeted. Contracts vanished. The diesel boom that should have made GM billions turned into one of the biggest PR disasters in automotive history. Inside the company, scapegoats were quietly fired. and engineers who had warned about the bad engines were reassigned or blacklisted. GM eventually killed the car diesel experiment, but the stench of failure lingered. The company's arrogance had turned an engineering marvel into a marketing nightmare, and while GM's board tried to bury the evidence, the rest of the industry watched and learned. Cummins, Caterpillar, and European rivals swooped in to take the markets Detroit diesel had lost. The empire that once ruled the roads was now being dismantled by its own incompetence. By the late 1980s, Detroit Diesel was a ghost division, a legendary name kept alive only by inertia. The workers who still punched in every morning did so under a cloud of shame and uncertainty. The plant floors were quieter now, the roar of the screamin' jimmies replaced by the echo of what once was. GM had promised America the future of power. What they delivered instead was the diesel deception, a corporate scandal that destroyed the very thing they had once built their empire on. And somewhere, buried under a mountain of memos and melted engine blocks, Detroit Diesel was still breathing. Barely, but not for long. The broken promise of the Series 60. By the late 1980s, Detroit Diesel wasn't dying, it was decomposing. The once proud division that had powered tanks, trucks, and entire nations was now a forgotten limb on General Motors' corporate body. GM no longer saw an engine builder. They saw a financial liability. The world around them was shifting. Japanese automakers were building smarter, cleaner engines, and European manufacturers were mastering fuel efficiency. But GM was still trapped in the golden age of tail fins and chrome, selling nostalgia while the competition sold the future. Then, out of the smog, came one final spark of genius. Engineers at Detroit Diesel had been secretly working on something radical, a clean, computer-controlled, four-stroke diesel engine that could outlast anything on the road. They called it the Series 60. It was everything the company hadn't been in decades, modern, efficient, and shockingly ahead of its time. This engine could diagnose itself, fine-tune its own performance, and burn less fuel than any of its rivals. It was, in every sense, Detroit's redemption on 4 cylinders. Inside the factory, hope returned. For the first time since the war, engineers walked into work believing they were building the future again. The Series 60 wasn't just an engine, it was a resurrection. It buried the ghost of the old screamin' Jimmy two-strokes that had defined Detroit Diesel's noisy past and promised a cleaner, quieter tomorrow. And for a brief moment it worked. When the Series 60 launched in 1987, it stunned the trucking world. It ran smoother, cleaner, and longer than anything Cummins or Caterpillar could produce. Drivers called it the million-mile motor. Fleet owners loved it. Mechanics praised its reliability. It was efficient, intelligent, and most importantly, American. The comeback story had written itself, but inside GM's high-rise offices, no one celebrated. To the corporate elite, Detroit Diesel was still an embarrassment, a greasy, blue-collar relic in a company obsessed with image and luxury. The Series 60 might have been revolutionary, but it wasn't glamorous. It couldn't sit next to a Cadillac in a showroom or be sold with a jingle on TV. And so, GM did what GM always did best when it didn't understand what it owned. It sold it. In 1988, General Motors quietly unloaded Detroit Diesel to racing magnate Roger Penske. Officially, they called it a strategic partnership. In reality, it was a fire sale. GM was bleeding money, and Detroit Diesel was dead weight. Penske, ever the opportunist, saw potential where GM saw only loss. He took the company, injected funding, and unleashed its engineers to do what they did best: innovate without interference. Under Penske's leadership, Detroit Diesel roared back to life. The Series 60 became a phenomenon throughout the 1990s, dominating the heavy truck industry. It was clean, powerful, and dependable, a rare trinity in American manufacturing. Penske gave Detroit Diesel the freedom GM never had, and the results spoke for themselves. For a few golden years, the company looked unstoppable, but the comeback didn't last. In 2000, Daimler, the German automotive giant, swooped in and bought Detroit Diesel from Penske in a multi-billion-dollar deal. On paper, it was salvation. Daimler promised to take Detroit Diesel global, to invest in innovation and to keep the Series 60 alive. But promises are easy in boardrooms, and Detroit had heard them all before. Once the deal was done, the slow death began. Daimler already had its own engines to sell and no interest in competing with Detroit's designs. The Series 60, despite its legendary performance, became a political inconvenience. Development stalled, funding dried up, engineers were reassigned, departments merged, and the Detroit plant fell eerily silent. For a few more years, the Series 60 kept selling on reputation alone. Truckers swore by it, but Daimler saw it as old technology. By 2010, they pulled the plug. The engine that saved Detroit diesel was discontinued, replaced by cold, soulless machines built for global uniformity. The brand that once symbolized the American grit had been erased by corporate efficiency. The death of the Series 60 wasn't a technical failure. It was a moral one. What GM had abandoned, Penske had revived. What Penske had revived, Daimler quietly buried. The engine that had promised to bring Detroit diesel into the future instead became its gravestone. And so, the story repeated itself. Another great American invention destroyed not by competition, but by corporate greed. Detroit diesel had built the heart that powered a nation. And in the end, it was that same heart that was ripped out by the hands that once praised it. The death rattle of an American icon. By the early 2000s, Detroit diesel was living on borrowed time. The Series 60 had given it a second life, but like all miracles born in corporate America, it came with an expiration date. Daimler, the new German overlord, didn't see Detroit diesel as a legacy to preserve. They saw it as an asset to absorb. Within a few years, the once proud American engine company became a logo, a subsidiary, a nameplate on paperwork. The screamin' jimmies were silent now, and the diesel heartbeat of Detroit was fading to a corporate whisper. Inside the factory, you could feel it. The noise was gone. The hammering of pistons, the metallic scream of testing bays, all replaced by the quiet hum of machines built somewhere else. Old workers who had survived GM's neglect and Penske's revival now watched their company die a slower, more humiliating death. Not in flames or bankruptcy, but in spreadsheets and boardroom memos. It wasn't sabotage, it was euthanasia. Daimler called it global integration. What it meant was that Detroit diesel's soul was being stripped for parts. Engineering moved to Germany. Production was consolidated. American jobs disappeared one by one. The plant that once armed the world now existed to assemble engines designed overseas. Every nut and bolt was a reminder that Detroit no longer led, it followed. The workers who stayed behind did so not out of loyalty, but out of inertia, clinging to the ghost of a company that no longer existed. By 2010, the writing was on the wall. Daimler officially discontinued the Series 60, the very engine that had saved Detroit diesel from extinction 2 decades earlier. Their reasoning? Modernization. Their real motive? Simplification. They didn't want 2 brands competing under one roof. The Germans already had their own engines built to their own standards, for their own markets. Detroit's future had no place in it. The final years were an exercise in corporate cruelty. New management spoke in buzzwords: efficiency, streamlining, synergy. They held press conferences about sustainability, while quietly laying off the very engineers who made Detroit diesel sustainable in the first place. The company's proud history, its wartime origins, its industrial triumphs, its blue-collar heroes, was sanitized, rewritten, and buried under glossy marketing slides. The factory that once symbolized American strength was now a museum of broken promises. Outside, the city of Detroit mirrored its namesake's decline. Once the arsenal of democracy, the Motor City had become the morgue of industry. Empty factories stood like tombstones, each bearing the name of a fallen giant: Packard, Hudson, Pontiac, and now Detroit Diesel. The same streets that once echoed with the rumble of engines were now quiet, littered with weeds and rust. What the wars couldn't destroy, capitalism did. For the men and women who had built those engines, who had sweated, bled, and inhaled diesel fumes for decades, the end came without ceremony. No farewell, no commemorative plaque, no salute to the generations that kept the machines alive. just pink slips and padlocks. The company that had once defined American horsepower died the way so many of its workers had lived, uncelebrated and overworked. By 2015, Detroit Diesel existed in name only, a trademark owned by Daimler, stamped onto products that bore no resemblance to the roaring beasts of the past. The screamin' jimmies, the Series 71s, the mighty Series 60, all gone. What replaced them were sleek, sterile engines built for compliance and cost-cutting, not passion or performance. It was the mechanical equivalent of embalming, preserving the body while killing the soul. In the end, the death of Detroit Diesel wasn't just the story of one company. It was the story of an empire eating itself. The same industrial machine that had built America's war engines and highway haulers ultimately consumed its own creation. It's the American paradox, innovation born from necessity, destroyed by greed. And yet, somewhere in that rusted city, the sound still echoes, a faint metallic scream, a whisper from a bygone era. Maybe it's memory, maybe it's myth, but for those who remember what Detroit Diesel once was, it's a reminder that America didn't just lose a company. It lost a piece of its mechanical soul, because the death rattle of Detroit Diesel wasn't just the sound of an engine dying. It was the last gasp of the American century.